welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a topic that is deeply complex and honestly pretty terrifying: the persistence of corruption. I mean, just to put this into perspective right out of the gate, global estimates suggest that over $2.6 trillion, that's roughly 5% of global GDP, is lost to corruption every single year. So what we're going to do today is look at why it's so incredibly difficult to defeat, what forms it actually takes, and perhaps the most fascinating part, why we humans often seem psychologically wired from birth to pursue personal gain and self-interest rather than transparency. We're going to dive into some pretty horrifying data, the psychology behind it all, and the systemic failures that keep this massive global issue alive. Now, you really have to ask yourself, if everyone hates corruption, why on earth does it survive? In places like South Africa and Kenya, you can literally walk up to government buildings and see signs outside that read, "This is a corruption-free zone." Just think about the terrifying reality behind that for a second. If you have to explicitly state that a specific building is corruption-free, well, it means corruption isn't the exception, right? It's the rule. It is a full-blown systemic epidemic. So, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the forms of corruption, the psychology of justification, cognitive shortcuts to corruption, why anti-corruption reforms fail, the collective action problem, and finally, breaking the corrupt cycle. Let's get right into it. Starting with Section 1, the forms of corruption. We often hear corruption broadly defined as the abuse of public power for personal gain, but it actually takes a bunch of very distinct forms. Take bribery, for example. That's a transaction where influence flows from society up to the state, basically an illegal payment for a favor. Extortion is the exact reverse. That's the state abusing its power to demand money from everyday citizens. Then you have graft and embezzlement, where public officials act completely on their own to siphon off public funds. There's fraud, which involves those really complex schemes to hide stolen money. And of course, nepotism, illegally channeling benefits to your family and friends. Now, corruption scales in two main ways. On one end of the spectrum, we have grand corruption. This is the stuff happening at the absolute highest levels of government. We're talking massive sums of money, top-tier policymakers, and it often results in the systemic siphoning of an entire nation's wealth by ruling elites. On the other side, though, we have petty corruption. This involves those smaller, everyday routine payments extorted by lower-level bureaucrats, think police officers or customs agents, just so citizens can access basic, completely legitimate services. Which brings us to Section 2, the psychology of justification. So why do we naturally adapt to personal gain? Well, the answer really starts with cognitive dissonance. Behavioral economics studies have revealed this genuinely horrifying paradox. Over 60% of people consistently rate themselves as highly ethical, but at the same time, they'll engage in minor deceptive or corrupt behaviors whenever they get the chance. This conflict between our moral self-image and our actual immoral actions creates deep psychological discomfort. Ideally, you'd think people would just stop doing bad things to resolve this conflict, right? But that is rarely what happens. Instead, the human brain adapts. We resolve the dissonance not by stopping the unethical behavior, but by inventing all these rationalization narratives to justify why we are somehow still good people, even while we continue doing bad things. And then consider this wild concept called moral decoupling. Now, unlike moral disengagement, where you justify your own bad actions, moral decoupling is how we judge others. It's a psychological process that entirely separates judgments of a person's performance from their ethics. Research actually shows that leaders who exhibit high moral decoupling will give higher performance evaluations to employees who engage in unethical behavior, just as long as they get the job done. They aren't exactly condoning the ethics, they're just completely decoupling them from the results. All right, moving to Section 3, cognitive shortcuts to corruption. The brilliant Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman distinguishes between two types of thinking: slow, logical thought, and fast, emotional intuition. And when we're making cost-benefit calculations about corruption, humans rely way too heavily on those fast, faulty mental shortcuts. Overconfidence makes us totally blind to our own ethical failings. Reciprocity drags us into corrupt networks just because we're trying to repay a simple favor. Scarcity and time pressure, those drastically increase unethical behavior. And social proof is just terrifyingly effective. Basically, in an ambiguous situation, if nobody else is trying to stop corruption, we naturally assume it's pointless for us to try. So we just join in. Listen to this specific finding from an interview study conducted in Africa. The quote goes, "It is not poverty. It is just a question of greed, just bad manners, wanting to amass and amass and amass for yourself." I mean, that violently shatters the whole myth that corruption is just a survival mechanism for the poor.
especially when we're talking about high-level elites engaging in grand corruption. The psychological driver isn't need at all. It is literally just an insatiable, self-centered greed. Let's shift gears to Section 4, why anti-corruption reforms fail.
Take the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, for example. This is a massive, legally binding international instrument that covers 44 countries. And get this, those countries account for about 81% of global foreign direct investment. It specifically targets the supply side of foreign bribery. Yet, despite these massive international legal frameworks, the data shows some really persistent gaps. These reforms just constantly fail, mostly due to weak political will, totally uneven implementation, and poor resource allocation. The laws exist on paper, sure, but the enforcement absolutely does not. And here is the core academic reason why these reforms fall flat. Almost all modern anti-corruption strategies are built on a theory called the principal-agent problem. This theory essentially assumes that there is a principal, like a boss or maybe the public, who is inherently honest and wants to stop corruption. The agent, say the employee or a politician, is the one acting corruptly because there's a lack of oversight. So following that logic, the traditional solution is just to throw in more monitoring and harsher punishments, assuming the honest principal will enforce them.
But that leads us into Section 5, the collective action problem. Because here is the crucial point. In systemically corrupt societies, that principal-agent theory is just completely wrong. Think about it. In a system where corruption is the absolute rule, there are no principled principles. The very people who are supposed to be enforcing the rules, the politicians, the police, the judges, they're also acting in their own self-interest. Therefore, simply adding more transparency or monitoring actually fails. Why? Because there's no uncorrupt authority left to enforce the rules anyway. Instead, corruption is what we call a collective action problem. It's essentially a massive coordination game based entirely on shared expectations.
There is complacency, everybody does it, so whether it is bad or good, everybody does it anyway. Am I the one who's going to change the world? That's a direct quote from citizens living in this reality. And survey data from Afrobarometer backs this up, showing that while a clear majority of citizens, often well over 70%, actually condemn corruption as wrong and punishable, they still participate in it. Why? Because the cost of acting fairly is simply way too high. If you don't pay the bribe at the hospital, you literally don't get life-saving treatment. If you report a corrupt colleague, you could lose your job. You are completely trapped by collective expectations. This systemic trap is perfectly encapsulated in that old phrase, "the fish rots from the head down." In a thoroughly corrupt system, the ruling elites are the ones gaining the most absolute wealth from maintaining the status quo. And their behavior sets the heuristic, the mental shortcut for the rest of society. When everyday citizens see government ministers becoming millionaires overnight with total impunity, it signals to everyone else that playing by the rules is just a fool's game. So how do we fix this? Section 6, breaking the corrupt cycle. The data clearly tells us that we cannot just rely on superficial technical fixes. Simply writing new laws or adding weak monitoring can actually make things worse by creating even more cynical, corrupt layers of bureaucracy. Instead, true reform requires shifting those shared expectations. It requires convincing an entire society that everyone else is finally going to play by the rules. We have to move from a system of particularism, where who you know determines what you get, to universal impartiality. And doing that requires absolutely revolutionary institutional change. Usually, that has to start with the elites tangibly proving, without a shadow of a doubt, that they are suddenly bound by the law. Which leaves us with this final, truly monumental question. How do we trigger the revolutionary institutional change needed to actually turn a corrupt equilibrium into an impartial system? I mean, it's really easy to sit here and say, we need a revolution in societal norms, but it is an entirely different beast to execute it against entrenched, greedy elites. I really hope this explainer has given you a clearer, if somewhat sobering understanding of the profound psychological and systemic roots of corruption. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this vital topic, and as always, keep asking the hard questions.